Good evening and welcome to the University of Denver. I hope I can say welcome again to the University of Denver. I hope you've been to our Bridges series this year. This is the last event in our Bridges program for academic year 2013-2014. As most of you know, the Bridges program began right after the 9/11 attacks in 2001. The university decided that it needed to respond in a way that was appropriate for a university like DU with a mission to serve the public good. So what we decided to do is create a series of events each year, and over the last few years we've selected a theme, and we have that this year as well. The idea was to bring the community into the university. This isn't only for our students and faculty, but it is for the community around us, our neighborhood. This year, we are celebrating our 150th anniversary of our founding in 1864. The committee of faculty and staff that meets each year to select a topic decided that we were going to look a little bit inward this year, so we decided to focus on the topic of higher education in 3 different manifestations. In the fall, we had 3 presidents and chancellors talk about some of the current issues in higher education. It was a fascinating conversation. Our Chancellor Coombe was part of that. In the winter, we hosted Professor Susan Schulten from the History Department, who gave us a talk, took us back to the 19th century in the Colorado Territory, and taught us a little bit about the founding of the University of Denver in this very unlikely place in the Colorado Territory. Tonight, we're going to turn to a broader topic, and it is a very interesting and powerful topic. The specific issue, which has many different parts, is to look at higher education in the era of change. This falls into this broad discussion of the future of higher ed. Let me give you a brief context about this, and then our speaker, Dr. Jim Griesemer, will elaborate. Last summer, DU convened a group of people, of faculty, staff, administrators, and community members to create a panel to discuss this topic. And I will not steal any of the thunder of Dr. Griesemer. It was an extraordinary thing to do. We met for a number of months. And Jim will be talking about the product of those conversations. I'll introduce Jim in a bit, but before I do that, I'd like to introduce our respondent for this evening, Scott Lataniger. Scott is a professor of computer science here at the University of Denver. He currently serves as the faculty senate president, and in that capacity, he was on this panel that looked at this topic. Scott has been extraordinarily effective in this role as a faculty senate president, not only in running a meeting that is almost impossible to run, but also participating in really, really meaningful ways in conversations about the future of higher education and the future of DU. But he's a trained computer scientist. He's published over 40 papers in top venues. His research has been devoted to areas of database management systems, using game development for computer science education and performance modeling. He's a scholar. His 40 papers have resulted in roughly 3,000 citations. He's been a PI or co-PI for over $2 million of external funding, including an NSF Career Award, which is a really big deal in this business. In 2008, he received the University of Denver Distinguished Teaching Award, which is awarded to one of our 700 faculty members each year. Before Scott became an academic, he actually worked at NASA, at the NASA Langley Research Center. He was a staff scientist there and did postdoctoral research at the IBM T.J. Watson Research Center. And Scott received his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, 1990. Thank you, Scott, for being our moderator this evening. Now we'll turn to our speaker, Dr. Jim Griesemer. Jim is a professor, Dean Emeritus of the Daniels College of Business. He currently directs the university's Strategic Issues Program, which is a non-partisan center that develops strategy to address significant policy issues. He also serves on the university's Board of Trustees. As I mentioned, this past year, Jim chaired the SIP, the Strategic Issues Panel examining higher education in an era of change. This was an 8-month effort that gathered information from a number of professionals, number of speakers, educational experts, advocates, some of us DU folks as well, to assess the changing environment of higher education and especially where DU fits into that. Jim has quite a resume. He served as Dean of the Daniels College of Business from 1994 to 2004. During his tenure, the college nearly doubled its enrollment, quintupled its endowment, constructed new buildings, and gained a national reputation for excellence. Subsequent to his service as Dean, he taught strategy and strategic management at the Daniels College. Before Jim became dean, he had another role at the university. He was a chief financial officer in one of the most interesting times that the University of Denver has ever experienced financially. And he did an enormous amount of work to right this ship, which he did in the 80s and 90s. During his years here, he was CFO. Prior to the University of Denver, he had extensive experience in public administration. He was a recipient of national and regional awards for excellence and was named Outstanding Public Administrator in Colorado years ago. Jim holds a bachelor's and master's degree from Northern Illinois, a doctorate in public administration from the University of Colorado. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jim Griesemer as our Bridges speaker this evening.
Thanks, Greg. Well, thank you, Greg, and thank you, everyone. Hope we don't get some feedback here. I'm going to try and walk around a little bit. I'm delighted to be here to talk about a subject that's near and dear to all of our hearts, and that is higher education. Almost everyone, I suspect, in this room has some connection with higher ed, either as an alumnus or serving in some capacity, perhaps being a contributor, perhaps serving on a board. And it's a pervasive and important part of our society. It's also a part of society that's about to undergo and is beginning to undergo really significant change. And so that's what I'd like to talk about this evening. This story begins with the University of Denver's commitment to the public good. DU, as part of its mission and vision, describes itself as a great private university dedicated to the public good. And that's really true. There are a number of activities that the university engages in that are focused on that objective. As I'm sure almost everyone knows, we hosted the 2012 presidential debates, which was a terrific experience for students, as well as the rest of us here, and also really helped put Denver and, of course, the university in the national spotlight. We sponsor TEDx programs, as well as the Bridges program, bringing in speakers from all over the world to talk about a variety of subjects to students, to faculty and staff, and also to the larger university and Denver community. Our Corabell School brings in world leaders on a regular basis, exposing our students to these talented folks as well as, again, the community at large. Within the Corabell School, there is an operation called the Pardee Center, which is not well known outside the university, but is a truly extraordinary outreach on the part of the university. It's a Center for International Futures that develops information that is used worldwide in terms of decisions made by nations across the world in terms of not only their economic processes, but their political and their civic processes. Quite a remarkable part of the university. We have the Institute for the American Legal System, which is doing some really path-breaking work, trying to improve and increase the effectiveness of the judicial system. And we bring in all kinds of folks, including Supreme Court justices, as a part of that dialogue. And then finally, there's the Strategic Issues Program that Greg alluded to. I'll take just a minute to talk a little bit about the program because it sort of sets the stage for tonight's discussion. The goal of the Strategic Issues Program is to foster thoughtful and informed discourse on important public policy issues. I like to say that we're sort of the antidote to the 30-second soundbite. We try and look pretty carefully at important issues that affect Colorado and the nation. We've looked closely at the operation and structure of state government. We've looked at state finances, both in Colorado and across the country. We studied immigration, and that panel's report was used by the Senate, along with other documents, in the development of the legislation, which is now in Congress. We've looked at water issues in the state of Colorado, did a major study on Colorado's Constitution, which I think we've reprinted 3 times now, is a major document used in discussions on that subject. We just last year released a report on campaign finance, which is generating some considerable interest, and of course, most recently, higher education. The process that the program follows is generally similar for all of these panels, even though the subjects are pretty diverse. First of all, the work of the Strategic Issues Program is not done just by scholars sitting somewhere and studying a topic. Rather, it involves a panel of accomplished Coloradans. We intentionally try and put together people with very diverse views, so we get lots of discussion. The model followed is one that has proven to be pretty interesting, and that is, it's based on the notion that before you come up with the answer, it's a good idea to understand the question. And so our panels spend about 2/3 of their time not talking, but listening. And in that process, we bring in experts from all around the world, Colorado, nation, and abroad, on the subject at hand. The panel, as the members of the higher ed panel could tell you, do a lot of reading. They read books, they read articles and monographs. It's a really in-depth process. But by the time they start talking about a subject, they really know what they're talking about. And that fosters a really thoughtful and civil discussion on whatever the topic is. Another unique aspect to this process is that it's a consensus-based process. There are no votes taken. So here the panel is dealing with some very, very volatile topics like immigration and whatever, and there's no votes taken. The panel finds its own way to a consensus position, and as a result, the reports issued by the panels have been very well received because they're pretty balanced. They really reflect a sort of a well-thought-out position. These processes are very detailed and very in-depth. The time frame, I believe the shortest one we ever did was 6 months. 8 to 12 months, as Greg mentioned, is more typical, and we've had some that have gone well beyond that. So it's a very in-depth look at whatever the topic at hand is. This panel, the higher education panel, over a period of about 7 or 8 months, had 13 meetings of 4 hours each. 7 of those meetings were focused on presentations where people came in and talked to the panel. And then 6 of the meetings were discussion meetings, where the panel went through and discussed in detail the information they'd received. We had 17 speakers, 6 from the University of Denver, almost twice that number from all around the country, experts in various dimensions of higher education. And it was a real transparent process. If you may not be able to see in that picture, but on the left-hand side of the picture, you'll see an audience. Everyone in the DU community was invited to come and listen to the process, and every meeting, every discussion of the panel was videotaped and made available to the entire DU community. It was a very, very open process and intended to be just that. So, here's the panel. We had 21 people in total. We had 7 DU trustees. We had 4 faculty members from various colleges. We had 5 administrators. And we had 5 people from the community. The common theme of all of the panel members was a really significant understanding of higher education. Obviously, in the case of the faculty and the administration, that was the case. But many of the trustees have served on other boards or are very active in higher ed. And our community members are genuine experts in higher education in many cases. Down at the lower right-hand corner, you see Kay Norton, who's the current president of the University of Northern Colorado, for example. All of the people on the panel had an abiding interest in this topic, but we all learned together as we went through this. So, as Greg said, we began with some presentations from folks from the university, kind of setting the stage. But then we brought in a number of folks from all over the country. In the left middle pane is Sylvia Manning. Sylvia is the president of the Higher Education Commission of the North Central Association, the organization that accredits hundreds and hundreds of schools in the middle part of the United States, including DU and CU and all of the schools around here. Below her is Stuart Butler, who's a distinguished scholar with the Heritage Foundation. Down in the lower right-hand corner is the representative Jonathan Rees, who is the president of the Colorado chapter of the American Association of University Professors. So we had a wide variety of inputs from a group of very, very thoughtful and knowledgeable folks. So there was lots of listening. The panel spent almost 4 months just listening. They couldn't talk. This was not an easy situation for them, but they were good. They listened. Lots of note-taking. Notes, notes, notes. Down in the lower right-hand corner, you see even the audience was taking notes. It's a little disarming. There was really a serious focus on this. So after about 4 months of listening and reading, studying the issue, the panel began its discussions. We held 6 4-hour meetings, 24 hours of discussion over a period of several months. The discussions were formal, and they also went on during the breaks, and they never seemed to stop. But a lot of interaction among the panel members. So, where did the panel come out? What I'd like to do is sort of take you through some of the things the panel discovered and raise not only the findings of the panel, but some of the questions that they raised. Because the focus of this group was not on finding answers, but was on trying to get the questions right, trying to understand the environment, and then being sure that we're focusing on the right issues. 2 other points I should make. This panel, uniquely, producing 2 reports. The first report is a DU-specific report. The second report, which will be released this summer, is a general report about higher education. But the information that I'll share tonight is generally applicable. We have folks in the audience tonight representing a number of colleges and universities in Colorado. And the information we'll talk about tonight is not DU-specific. It's general and applicable, we think, to colleges and universities across the country. So the panel listened and listened and listened. And one of the things they came away with, as a sort of a baseline item, is this perception of permanence that kind of permeates higher education. Universities are among the oldest institutions in human history. The University of Bologna, for example, this century, which is the metric you have to use, will turn 1,000 years old. In Europe, there are almost 20 universities that were founded in the Middle Ages and are alive and well today. So you have this very, very strong sense of permanence that you get. This long history just exudes stability. It begins with the institution itself, the accomplishments of faculty, the achievements of alumni, the significance of what goes on in a place like DU or CU or CC. It's reinforced by the physical environment, by the campus, by the stately buildings, by the open spaces and landscaping. It really establishes a strong sense of place, kind of a mnemonic for learning. All these things reinforce sort of timeless sense of learning and education and create this sense of permanence and stability. But even among this backdrop of stability, there is a growing sense of unease that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. The rapid increase in tuition and fees. We all talk about the dramatic increase in healthcare. Tuition and fees at universities has risen 30% faster than healthcare. It's one of the fastest rising components of our society, way beyond the ability of most people to keep up. Challenges to educational effectiveness. A book published about 18 months ago called Academically Adrift cited a study that claimed, and it looked at a lot of universities, that claimed that 45% of the students, they couldn't detect any significant learning in the first 2 years in college. And of course, the inability of graduates to find jobs. Not in a tough labor market, but it goes beyond that. Sort of challenges about the relevance of what we in universities are providing our students. There's the claim that institutions are becoming, creating a resort-like atmosphere. Climbing walls, gourmet food, high-end dorms, and the like. This climbing wall is not DU's climbing wall. This is at the University of Georgia. I personally think ours is better. And concerns about growing non-academic expenses, expensive athletic programs, extensive array of student services which cost a lot of money. So the question is, could such stable institutions, among the most stable in history, could such stable institutions be disrupted by events and by some of these challenges? Well, to find an answer to that, the panel didn't have to look much beyond the print media, the venerable Fourth Estate. So the printing press was invented a long time ago, 1450. For about 400 years, there have been newspapers, more or less, in the form that we know them today. Been in widespread use a long time. Then came the internet. And what did that produce? Well, here's an overview. It produced a 60% decline in print advertising revenue nationally in a period of 10 years. The red line at the bottom shows the success that the industry has had trying to replace that revenue with online advertising. So the result, shattering change, really shattering change. Closures, layoffs. The Rocky Mountain News, founded 5 years before the University of Denver, on its 150th birthday, closed. Cincinnati Post, the Tucson Citizen, and many other papers, well over 100 years old each, are no longer in existence. Other papers have transformed themselves. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer, printed for 146 years in Seattle, is now a little online website. And then there have been the sales. News Corp bought the Wall Street Journal, and most dramatically, Jeff Bezos from Amazon bought the Washington Post. He paid $250 million for it, a number that would have been literally unthinkable a decade earlier. In 15 years or less, a 400-year-old industry was upended and remains so today. Newspapers are searching for new models, trying all kinds of things, as we all see. But they're not alone. The music industry, book publishing, landline telephone, old POTS, plain old telephone, cable TV, all of these are experiencing enormous disruptions. What are the common themes? Well, as the panel looked at this, it seemed that there were a couple. One is many of these are information-based industries, just like universities, and they are often technologically based or grounded. So the question that the panel came up with was, is it really possible for such disruption, such shattering change to occur in higher education? Well, a lot of the experts we've talked to think it is. And so with that in mind, the panel said, well, where do we begin? You have all this stuff going on. Where do you start? And so they started by looking at the underlying forces that drive change in society. And you know these. There's economic forces, demographics, technological innovations, global trends, and the like. These are forces of profound importance and profound change. So we began to try and look at those and see what might happen in education. So we started by looking back. And we looked back to the golden age of higher education in this country, which began at the end of World War II. So what was happening then? Well, over the period, we began the longest period of economic expansion. College was pretty affordable. It was clearly seen as a ticket to a better life, to economic upward mobility. The baby boomers started being born, and within about 20 years, they became this immense market, as many of us know firsthand. International students started coming to the U.S. to go to school, at first in small numbers, and then in larger and larger numbers, as you'll see. And the global climate was perfectly benign. That is, it provided us students, but it didn't provide any competition. It was almost the perfect situation. And of course, importantly, were government actions. The GI Bill, right after World War II, supplemented later by a variety of student loan programs, which are still in effect today, of course. A dramatic growth in federal government spending for research, a vast majority of which went to universities, and very generous support by states of their state institutions. So, what did all these forces create? Well, here's what they created. Over 60 years of almost nonstop growth in enrollments. Enrollments grew by tenfold during this period. So the stars really were aligned. The forces that we just talked about were really important and really meaningful. But here's the thing. The forces are important, but individual institutions can't change them. We can't change demographics, nor can anybody else. We can't change global trends. So what's important is the conditions in the environment that those forces create And that's where the panel then focused its energy. So after a long bit of study, the panel identified 10 conditions that they thought were particularly important to universities generally, and some of them to DU in particular, but really to universities generally. A couple of things to observe. These forces can be supportive or disruptive. So, as we just saw, the forces can be very supportive and create a very strong environment of growth, or they can be disruptive. They also have differential impacts. Some of the forces affect everybody, like demographic forces, and other forces, like financial condition, may or may not affect everyone. So the forces are differential, which means there is no silver bullet here. There's no one-size-fits-all for dealing with this. The other thing that I think is important, we'll talk about, I'll touch on these areas very briefly, but the way to think of them is not, I think, so much as discrete entities. The way to think of them is a pattern of a confluence pattern. What you really have are these forces coming together. And it's a classic case, I think, where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And so as we talk about these things, it's easy to think about, oh, there's this and there's that, but it's really much more complex than that. It's like throwing a series of pebbles in a lake and watching the ripples intersect. So dealing with this is not a simple matter. Okay, well, let's go through these. I won't belabor them, but I want to give you an idea of what the panel thought and what they found and the questions that they think are fairly important. So we'll start with the Knowledge Society. So you know all about this. It's the new economic order. It really is a big change. It's based on manual labor, requiring high levels of skills, which requires education. And institutions like DU and CU and others, we produce the raw material of the Knowledge Society. We do the research, we create the knowledge, we distribute the knowledge to students, and so universities underlie the Knowledge Society, a global phenomenon. It's produced, and will continue to produce, the panel believes, a long-term growth industry in higher education. So it is, in its grossest sense, very positive. But it'll also produce a lot of competition, and we're already seeing that, and I'll share some of that with you. Competition not only from traditional institutions, but from international institutions and from for-profit institutions. So the next area the panel looked at was the increasing cost of higher education. So here is, you can see the numbers for yourself. This is percentage increase in tuition for public and for private universities. So you can see the public universities have gone up over 250%, privates about 150. These are inflation-adjusted numbers. These are real numbers. And one should also remember that the private institutions started at a much higher base. So that while you see the publics going up faster, they started from a much lower spot. So privates are, of course, still, generally speaking, much more expensive. The other thing that's interesting to look at on this chart is the dogleg in the public institutions. It starts in 2004. And it coincides with the states beginning to pull back, and Colorado is an excellent example, pull back public funding of institutions. And I'll show you a little bit more about that in a minute. Shifting demographics. So this chart's kind of busy, so let me try and simplify it for you just a tad. There's two lines to look at here. The top line and the bottom line. The top line, this is the anticipated graduation rate of students over the next about 15 years from now. It starts at 2009, by race and ethnicity. So the top line is the expected graduation rate for Hispanics. You see it's up 68%. The bottom line is the expected graduation trend for white families, which is down 13% during that period. So big changes going on in the demographic structure of the student bodies we'll be seeing. So here's putting together some demographic and income information. If you look at the top two bars, the groups that are doing the best, you see that Asians and whites have median family incomes over $71,000. If you look at the next two down, the lower groups, Hispanics and black families, have median income family levels of under $41,000. There's a 60% difference. And so we see great disparities. The bottom part of this chart is interesting. If in spite of all the problems, if there was ever any question about the value of investing in a higher education degree, this is proof positive. And if you were to overlay on this unemployment numbers, you would see an even more dramatic pattern. The higher the education, the lower the unemployment, the greater the income. It's a very clear pattern. This presumes, of course, that you can afford to go to college. Well, if I put these two together, you see clearly what you've already figured out, and that is that in the Hispanic population, you have a huge growth rate, but a relatively low median family income. In the white population, the traditional source for students for many schools, you have a much stronger economic situation, but a declining demographic. So the question is, how can universities deal with a market that the growing segment is having a great deal of trouble affording the price of education, while those who can afford it more readily are declining? So this is the chart I showed you a minute ago. And if there's one chart you remember from this little talk, I hope this is the one. So here's the percentage increase of public and private institutions. And here is the growth of median family income during the same period. So what you have is an enormous case of declining affordability. Think about this question. How do universities and colleges stay in business when their cost is rising at 10 to 15 times the rate of family income? Well, so you say, wait a minute, though. I look back at that chart of the golden era of education, and it went up and up and up and up. How did that happen if there was this huge disparity? Those guys in higher ed must be really smart if they can keep the enrollments going up. Well, the answer, of course, is debt. Here's the growth of student debt. This happens to be arrayed by age group. It's the numbers on the left-hand side are in billions. And as you probably know, in 2012, student loan debt surpassed all other forms of debt except for home mortgages in terms of its size. So a huge burden. The question, of course, is how long can the growing segments of society, the growing markets, how long can they continue to afford the burden of such debt? Another thing we talked about a good deal was the commodification of information. So information is now a global commodity, you know that. Big data, a pure information product. It's driving business, it's creating competitive advantage. I, in doing some research, read that 12,000 exabytes, that would be a billion bytes of information, were created by humankind last year. I cannot personally verify this, but that's what I'm told. And I'm also assuming, since I've never actually touched an exabyte, that this represents a lot of information. But it is serious business. The Daniels College just created a degree in business information and analytics. It's a degree in big data, a business degree. And many schools are doing exactly the same thing. Pure information product driving business and driving what a number of us are doing. From cyberspace to the real world, 3D printers, the Internet of Things, selling big machines based on their information content, customizing medicines based on genetic information. Information is everywhere and it's shaping the real world. It's not this ephemeral thing. It's shaping, as you know, our lives. You can go online, you can get detailed information on any topic from aeronautical engineering to zoology, and you can get pretty good information. Here's the point. Information is no longer a private treasure held closely in the universities, available only to the scholars and to those students who have the time and money to learn the secrets. Information is freely available today to everybody on the planet. Now, this presents an interesting problem for places of higher education. How do you charge those growing prices that we've just seen for something that everybody else is giving away? What's the business model for that? I'm not sure. Academic practices. This is an area that we looked at because it affects how institutions can relate to their environment. Now, when I put this up, you're thinking, tenure. And if you listen to the radio talk shows and the cable TV news, you certainly will find lots of talk about tenure, the evils of tenure, and how terrible it is. And it's one of the things we looked at and talked about a lot. Tenure is interesting because it's both a public and a private good. It's a public good because protecting the free speech of the professoriate and of researchers fosters the marketplace of ideas on which our society is built and which our Constitution acknowledges. Indeed, all of Western society and most of the rest of the world has adopted this idea of the marketplace of ideas to move society forward. It is an enormously important thing, and I, for one, believe that people do get threatened for coming up with ideas that don't meet the mainstream views. So I think it's enormously important to protect that. At the same time, tenure as it's unfolded, and it's different in different institutions. I need to tell you that. There's no sort of uniform tenure document. As it's unfolded, there's certainly a component of job security. We've seen the worst illustrations of that, certainly in the media. So here are the kinds of questions that rub together for universities. How do you encourage new ideas? One of the reasons for our existence. And at the same time, how do you deal with performance questions when that happens, when you have genuine questions? And perhaps most significantly in the years to come, how do you redeploy talent in a rapidly changing environment? These systems that we operate in universities were largely built for a different age. How do we optimize tenure in a way that respects the vitality and the importance of knowledge, and yet allows universities and institutions of higher education to be supple in the face of a change at a rate that has never existed before? Curriculum. The faculty owns the curriculum. Indeed, they do. And the faculty decides whether the curriculum is successful. But how does that interact against the people who are paying the bill, the ever-increasing bill? The parents, the students, employers are the ultimate judges because they vote with their tuition dollars. How do we create feedback mechanisms that build on the strength of the faculty, but respect the observations and understandings of those who are receiving the benefit of the education? Shared governance, a slow, deliberate process of decision-making. I heard of a school that changed the name of the degree, didn't change anything else. They didn't change the credit hours, they didn't change the courses, they changed the name of the degree, and they were able to process that decision in just a little over 2 years. So the issues, born in an era of slow change, universities are now confronted with a rapidly changing environment. How are we going to do this? We came from an era where knowledge was limited, and we're now in an era, which, as we've seen, where it's abundant. Accreditation, probably don't think about this too often, but this has been our moat. Accreditation has kept at bay those who would innovate in higher education. But that's not true anymore. Today, there are hundreds and hundreds of for-profit organizations that are accredited by major national, they're done on a regional basis, accreditors. And so we are now finding ourselves in a melee. So different than what those of us who've been around this a while have gotten used to. Disruptive technology, you know all about this. Online courses, 6.7 million people were taking them in 2011. The number is undoubtedly higher today. About 32% of students are taking at least one online course. You've heard of MOOCs, perhaps, massively open online courses that may involve 10,000, 20,000, 50, or 150,000 students, done online globally. One of the companies that does this is a company called Coursera. So if you look on their website, you'll find that a few months ago they were offering 542 courses. Now, these were not all being taught by somebody from their basement. They were being taught by partners, Duke, Johns Hopkins, and so on, very fine professors at very fine schools. Are they a substitute or replacement for in-class learning? Probably not. Are they going to change the way we do things in higher ed? They already are. And so, what does this cost to get? I took one of these courses because I thought I ought to try it. So I took a course in strategic management, which I teach. It was taught by a guy from a university in Pennsylvania at the University of Leipzig and broadcast to about 26,000 of us who were taking the course. It wasn't bad. It was a pretty good course. So what did I have to pay for that? Well, of course, nothing. These courses are free. We can extend that and talk, and it's really interesting, online degrees. Now, nobody knows how many online degrees there are. Probably limited only by the number of garages where people can do them. But if you go online to a thing called the Guide for Online Schools, there's now over 12,000 degrees mentioned there from 528 schools, and some of the schools are pretty good places. This last year, U.S. News & World Report began to rank online programs. 1,000 universities applied to be ranked. Best bachelor's degrees, Central Michigan, SUNY School, Penn State. Best master's degrees, Indiana, UCLA, University of Southern California. These are not bad schools. And so we're seeing the growth of online degrees, reaching those large numbers of folks who are being priced out of traditional education. Now, how were these priced? Well, they started out, the university said, we're going to charge the same price. We're not going to compete against ourselves. We're going to charge the same price. That's changing, and prices are beginning to fall. At the very end of 2012, Georgia Tech announced a degree in computer science, a master's degree for $7,000 all in. Now, if you're a public school, you might be charging $30,000 for that. If you're a private school, you might be charging $60,000 or $100,000 for that. How does a traditional university compete in the face of name schools offering degrees such as this? The innovation is not limited to technology. Pedagogical innovation is enormously significant. And online competency-based education is something that I think one needs to watch. It assesses student learning instead of seat time and grades. So a student takes a class. At the end of the class, they take a test. The tests are standardized tests. They're sometimes they're industry-approved tests in whatever field the student is studying. And the student takes a test. So this revises the role of the professor. So here's how it works. At Western Governors University, for example, the courses are designed, the curriculum is established by a group of PhDs who are experts in the subject. Then the student is mentored throughout his or her career at the school by a professor, and then has a second mentor on each course. And then finally, those who are assessing the courses are different than those who created the courses. So what does this do to the traditional role of the professor? Well, there isn't one. The role is gone. Those of us who hold such a title find this disquieting, to say the least. What's most important about this, though, I think, is it changes an industrial age model, which we in the university business still use more or less, to a mass customization model. Instead of the student having to fit our structure, our semesters, our quarters, our grading system, and that, the student proceeds at his or her own pace, and competency is judged by the test. And so you can work and take these courses, you can travel or whatever. It is a very, very different model. It also changes the pricing model. So here's a chart that shows some schools that have online competency-based degrees. It's hard to read, I know. So the boxes show what the price is of these degrees. If you look at Western Governors, below that box, you see the degrees that are offered. There's a whole lot of degrees offered. All online, all competency-based. So if you average these, a year at these schools is about $6,000. So a mid-priced private school today costs $26,000. Number of publics are approaching that number, and it's easily possible for a private school to charge $40,000 or $50,000 or $60,000 a year. So are there disadvantages to this? Well, of course there are disadvantages to it. You don't have the intellectual environment. You don't have the kind of personal mentoring that our professors. You don't build the part of the community. You don't have the late-night discussions in the dorm. You're really by yourself, mostly. So there are some significant disadvantages, no question about it. Are there advantages? Sure are. It's serving the group that has been priced out by higher education. It is also, these are also typically, not exclusively, but typically vocationally oriented. And so, what we're finding is that companies tend to hire these students because they know what the standard was. They don't know what a B is in a class that I teach, but they do know a test that their industry developed. And so placement of these programs is much stronger than you might expect. So is this a disruptive innovation? Well, if you're Harvard or Princeton, it's probably not, because you can provide enormous financial support to your students. But for almost everybody else, it probably is a significant disruption. So, as the panel looked at this, they saw increasing costs, demographic shifts, as we looked at declining affordability. Then they saw disruptive technologies and pedagogical innovation, and they see the creation of alternatives to traditional educational structures. And not surprisingly, those two together equal increased competition. So, who are the competitors that places like DU and CSU and all of us face? Well, they're traditional institutions, and increasingly they're public universities who have gotten much leaner and much more aggressive as their funding has been cut. But there's a lot more. International colleges and universities are becoming very, very engaged in the process of attracting students from other countries. It's a major financial benefit to those countries. Here's a little factoid. China, in 1999, had just over 1,000 colleges. These are regular colleges and universities. 10 years later, they more than doubled the number. These aren't offices in an office building. These are campuses. So there's huge growth going on internationally, and international colleges, the U.S. has been and continues to be the sort of model, but that is changing. Private, for-profit providers. These folks tend to be innovators in technology. A number of them are using competency-based education, not all by any means. So the market share here is still relatively small, but look at this. In 8 years, the market share of the for-profits doubled from 6 to 12%. So what does that look like? It looks like 2.4 million students getting $32 billion in financial aid. The Apollo Group, the University of Phoenix, the enrollment there is greater than the 10 largest nonprofit universities combined. So these places are capable of enormous scale and are serious competitors for universities. So we have increased competition, and not surprisingly, that yields enrollment pressures. So here's an interesting chart, and I'll try and explain it to you. So the the blue lines are decline in overall undergraduate enrollment. The green line is a decline in first-year students, and the red line is the decline in both. So comprehensive doctoral universities, these are the flagship universities, these are the CU-type universities, overall saw an 11% decline in their undergraduate enrollments. 11%. Remember the line where the enrollments went up forever? Well, that's not what's going on. Research universities, University of Denver is a research university, saw a decline, again, overall. DU happens to be on the other side of this, fortunately, but as a whole, saw a decline of about 4%. But look what's going on in the small colleges. Where you don't want to be is the president of a small, unfunded liberal arts college in the middle of Iowa. These schools have lost over 80%, over 80% of these schools are seeing a decline in both total undergraduate enrollment and in new undergraduate enrollment. It is becoming a very, very tough world out there. So what are they doing about it? Well, one of the things they're doing is increasing the discount rate. Many of you know, but for those of you for whom that might be a new term, discount rate are simply scholarships funded by the university itself. Okay? And almost every school does it to some degree or another. But in general, these represent different types of schools. In general, we've seen in the last 10 or 12 years about a 10% increase in the average discount rate. Now that comes directly off the bottom line of the university. That is a huge investment. That is a huge number. So that's one way that schools are there are schools now where their discount rate is approaching 50%. So it's like buying an apple for 5 cents, selling it for 4, and saying, I'll make it on volume. It's not going to work. What else? What are the other strategy? Well, this line shows, if you really just look at the red bars, that's the growth of Chinese students with F1 student visas. Chinese students have flocked to U.S. universities, and in some schools, in some colleges and some universities represent a very significant percentage of students. But think back to what China's doing. It's doubled the number of its own universities in 10 years. Moreover, China, with the decline in the economic activity in China, Chinese graduates are having trouble getting jobs. So is this a good long-term strategy for schools? Well, maybe not. So, enrollment pressures lead to financial stress, not surprisingly. And the folks who've seen this as clearly as anyone are the public universities. So this chart shows the decline in educational appropriations from 2007 to 12 across all of the states. The red bar in the center is the U.S. average. You can see it's declined about 23%. I put an arrow at Colorado. That's declined about 30%, although Colorado schools got a little better news out of this most recent legislature, but they're still way below where they've been. So what has their strategy been? Well, they've raised tuition. You saw the dog leg in the chart I talked about earlier. This shows the raising of tuition, the percentage of tuition in terms of the total revenue at these schools. And you see it's doubled, essentially, during this period. And it's gone from about 23%. What's interesting is the shaded sections are recessions. And you see how the publics have had to raise their tuition even as their total budgets have gone down. It's a real vice effect for the public universities. Well, so the fiscal stress, how have we in the university business dealt with that? Well, we have increasing costs and demographic changes, so that's created declining affordability, as I mentioned. We have technology innovations. We have educational innovations. That's created alternatives. That's led to increased competition, which has produced enrollment pressures. So what have we done? We've built more climbing walls. We've built nicer dorms. We've created a host of amenities to try and attract the students. We've increased our discounts, which of course have reduced our net income, and we've dealt with that by increasing tuition again. So is this strategy sustainable for universities? Probably not. It's not something that's probably going to work. So let me close with this. This list on the left are the challenges that I've just touched on in only a very brief way. And the report we issue in this summer will go into these in somewhat more detail. The thing the panel also looked at, which I'm not going to address tonight, but I'll just show you, is what are the kinds of strategies then, generically, what are the kinds of strategies that universities could use in order to deal with this? And so they've looked at things which won't surprise you. The need to be market-oriented, to be sensitive. The need to really differentiate yourself and to document that. You know, if you look at university brochures, you find out that most of the universities in the United States teach courses with students sitting under a large tree. You know, it's very difficult to identify a lot of difference. Demonstrable value. It's critical that universities focus on value that they can document, particularly at the prices that are being charged. A culture of measurement. The need to understand what we're doing. You can't correct, you can't improve if you don't know where you are. Institutional flexibility. I talked about us coming from a different age. We need to find a way to balance those values. Financial viability. Universities have to have money to invest, and yet they're in this spiral. Very, very tricky problem. Educational innovation, where it makes sense, of course, and serving stakeholders. The most difficult thing when you're at a university is to decide whose needs get met first, since we have so many stakeholders. So, what does that mean? Well, it means that each school has to find its own way. But what we've tried to do is to say, okay, here's the environment, at least as the panel saw it, here are some strategies, and for each of us, for each institution, we need to find our own path. But it is pretty clear that in this unsettled age, in these unsettled times, we need to get to work doing it. Thanks very much.
First of all, thank you, Dr. Griesemer.
Thank you.
I'm really pleased to be here, and it may not be for the reason you think. It's not often that a faculty member gets asked to put a dean emeritus and a trustee on the spot with questions.
This was not my idea.
So I actually, just listening to you talking, there's a couple of responses I had right away.
Sure.
One of them was, there's so much information out on the internet now, as you said, and everything is, quote, free. So why do we need higher education? What, in terms of the amount of information, do you think that that makes it easier or harder for people to actually be able to gain knowledge versus information? And do you think that this presents new opportunities for higher education on how to synthesize all these great amount of information out on the web?
Scott, I do think it presents great opportunities. And here's why. You can't play the information game because there's no revenue associated with the information game. But information isn't education. Education is creating an understanding, creating a knowledge of how to take information and apply it. And I think universities need, again, I'm speaking now for myself, I think universities need to be very sure that they're not competing with the commoditizers of information, and it's pretty easy to do that, and that's where I think the differentiation is so important. I think there is plenty of room for viability, but I think you have to stay far away from the commodity information game. The idea, and Scott, you know this as well or better than I, so you're seeing some of that go on now with what's called flipped classrooms, where the information gets passed to the student electronically, but the learning occurs in the classroom. And so I think it's something to be very sensitive to, but I think there's lots of opportunities for higher ed.
So you just said that the learning occurs in the classroom rather than consuming information from the web. What advantages does a residential model for college give one for specifically this task of actually synthesizing and creating new knowledge?
Well, I still am one who believes that the magic occurs in the classroom. So I'm in the archaic category apparently, but I think the issue is this. I think the use of technology is inescapable, and I think it is frankly highly desirable. The idea of universities circling the wagons and saying we did it this way in 1951 and 1851 and 1751, I think is a non-viable approach. I think we need to find for our students, for the markets that we're serving, I think we need to find a blend, and each university, I think, needs to find that. There will be some commonality. I think each university needs to find that on its own. So I don't think the classroom will disappear, but I do think that we'll use it in different ways. I think we'll use it with different frequencies. I think we'll have people taking courses outside and then coming inside, sort of mixed model. I think there's a whole host of models that will evolve.
Okay, thank you. So you were talking about the rise of online technology and MOOCs, and you were talking about how this is going to be moving education to be more affordable for others. And one of the things that you said is that they are serving a group that has been priced out. So my question there is, given the changing demographics, does this mean that the lower socioeconomic status classes are basically being priced out of the opportunity for this wonderful experience in the classroom and to synthesize the knowledge, and hence we're just reinforcing barriers and making access more difficult?
I'd give you a one-word answer if I could, but I don't think I know how to do that. I think there's a couple things going on. I worry about a further separation of those who have the means to come to a place like the University of Denver and those who don't have the means to do that. And as the panel looked at the price increases, it's just compelling. And so I think as a society, we need to worry about further creating this separation that we're all talking about these days, the economic separation, which is inexorably linked to the educational separation. That having been said, I think the online courses, the online degrees, create an opportunity that we should not forego for people who don't have choices. And this really gets into the issue of national social policy. But I think as a country, we need to take very seriously this business that we are taking the growing segments of our society and making it prohibitive for them to get a good education. I'm very troubled by that. And if I had an answer, I would patent it. Okay. I don't.
So I'm also asking questions that were given to me by the audience, and one of those, an earlier one was also, but one of those is Inside Higher Ed survey published recently in the Chronicle of Higher Education. It said that 96% of college leaders feel that they are preparing students for the workforce, yet only 16% of CEOs feel that college grads are prepared for the workforce. What do you think that DU and other schools like DU should be doing to bridge this gap?
Besides changing the administrators? Sorry, Greg, that was a joke. I think it's interesting. I've seen those numbers. I think it is interesting that we here in the Academy think we're doing a great job, but some of those folks out in the world don't think we're doing as good a job. Here to me is a related question, maybe even a fundamental question. And that is, when we talk to CEOs, we're really talking about how well have we prepared people from a professional and an occupational point of view. For those of us who have liberal arts undergraduate degrees, some of us think education is about more than just occupational training. And so, and this is a big problem, because if you're spending a huge amount of money to send your kid to school, you want that child to be able to get a job. That's a perfectly, having done that 3 times, that's a perfectly reasonable expectation. But as a society, you know, public education was not started in the United States as job training. It was started to build citizenship. And so we need to take very seriously, again, I'm speaking only for myself, we need to take really seriously this whole question of building a strong society. And so the question is really beguiling, because there's different assumptions of what constitutes excellence built into that question. So I really don't mean to fire the administrators. It's different expectations about what we should do. And so at DU, for example, and I know other universities are doing this, we're really talking about, should we have different goals for undergraduate education versus graduate education? Should there be different lengths of time? Maybe 4 years is not enough for too much, but we're starting to ask those questions here, and I know other places are as well. But this whole separation of higher education for occupational purposes vis-a-vis citizenship and the intrinsic values it provides in terms of the appreciation of art, critical thinking, understanding the value of other perspectives. There's a great quote from a Chicago columnist, Sidney Harris, from the 1940s, and he said, "Education turns mirrors into windows. We stop looking at ourselves and look beyond to a larger world." And I think that discussion and the strategies that come out of that are just enormously important.
Thank you. If the government would fund it, I think you just answered everything right there. Another question from the audience. So this issue of competency-based learning that you alluded to, one of the places that it really becomes pertinent is AP classes from high schools. One of the arguments in favor of AP credit is that it can reduce the cost of college education. Do you feel that this is a good mechanism to reduce the cost of college education, or rather, should this be used as an opportunity to deliver to our college students higher level classes that build upon that knowledge, and so instead of getting rid of classes, give us an opportunity to better educate our college students?
Yeah, I think that's a false choice. I don't know what the answer is, Scott, but it seems to me that AP classes are all to the good. My understanding is that they're becoming more rigorous in terms of being accepted at colleges and universities. We are seeing, and many schools are, students come in with close to a year, at least a half a year of credits. We're also seeing students get through faster by taking interterm courses, by taking more summer courses. Students and their families are under enormous pressure because of the cost, and we should recognize that. And there's no simple answer to it. But somehow the idea of saying that AP classes are bad doesn't strike me as true. And I guess I'm not certain whether we should say, well, you can't take courses. I'd want to think about that.
All right. And also on the side of trying to reduce college costs, one thing that's been happening in the last more in the last 4 years, but especially in the last 4 years, is a significant shift in teaching power has moved from tenured and tenure-track faculty to lecturers and even to a large number of adjunct faculty. Certainly these groups are much less expensive and can reduce the cost. Where do you think the correct balance lies in higher education on a whole? I'm not talking about DU, on a whole.
Thank you for that question, Scott. I was actually going to ask the president of the Faculty Senate. You are the president of the faculty. Here's the real story on tenure. Tenure is disappearing. You hear all these debates about tenure, and it's the great evil that's going to sink the ship, but that's just simply not so. Here's the numbers. In 1975, 57% of all university professors were either tenured or tenure-track. Today it's 30%. And it's expected to go to 20%. Now, part of that's being driven by economic reasons. Adjunct professors who are paid not very much money are a lot cheaper. Some adjunct professors are outstanding teachers. Some are not as good. It seems to me that we need to be willing to take a step back and re-examine tenure and not talk about just tweaking it, because in my view, the speed of change in the environment requires more than tweaks, not just to tenure, but to a whole bunch of things. I think we need to look and say, okay, what are the interests that have to be met? Universities have to have some flexibility. But the notion of a teacher-scholar is a very valuable model. And I hesitate to say, oh, well, let's just get rid of that. We the panel looked, and you know, Scott, we looked at a lot about this. And lots of schools are talking about it. I have yet to see a model that I think really addresses all of this. But to me, it's very clear that this has to be a priority for universities, not just here, but really everywhere. And I think you've talked about optimizing tenure. I think that's what we need to be talking about.
Okay. And this one's going to be our last question for the evening. You were talking about online degrees, and you brought up the Georgia Tech master's degree in computer science, which hits close to home.
I thought it might.
And you were talking about the benefits of a mass customization model, the ability to start at any time, take classes wherever you are, and hence it's friendlier to the student. But my questions are, how likely are these degrees going to be able to provide one-to-one mentoring? Is there any opportunity for content creation? One of the principles of higher education in this country, or benefits over the past 100 years, has been fomenting all these wonderful ideas that have had spin-offs. Is that going to occur in an online model? And will we prepare students for a career of creating rather than a career of doing what they've been taught? And does the online model help or hinder that?
I think it does both in a way. I don't think an online model prohibits people from being creative. I think that's part of personalities that can blossom in any kind of situation, really. I think the tendency is to create typologies and say, here's the online model and it's da-da-da-da-da. Here's the classroom model and it's da-da-da-da-da. I really think that what we're going to see is lots of experimentation, and we're going to find models that we don't even have words for right now that take the best of different things. So I'm for one, am not anxious to try and answer those questions, because I think our definitions are very narrow, and I really think those will change over time.
Super. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim, and thank you, Scott. We were just getting warmed up. I thought we were going to have another strategic issues panel meeting. This would last 4 hours, and we did a number of them. And don't kid yourself, they each put the other on the spot regularly in those meetings. Thank you, Jim, for your presentation. This is an extraordinarily important topic for the university, any university, certainly for the University of Denver. What I think is really advantageous for us is that we at least have some sense, and a pretty deep sense, of what we're facing out there. The proof of the pudding is what we're going to do about it. And we're in the midst of a strategic planning process at the University of Denver that will, we hope, allow us to begin to get a handle on some of these issues. These are, as you saw, extraordinarily complex. I want to thank you as an audience for coming to listen to issues that certainly concern us and universities in a deep way, but as I hope you saw this evening, concern the entire society. Those demographics are pretty startling. And if we have anything that universities and colleges must do, they must serve the public good. Thank you for attending this evening, and I hope you were able to attend our other two events this past year. I was able to bring up on my phone what our topic is for next year, just to give you a preview. We've not got it completely worked out, but the tentative title is Transforming Media, New Realities of the Digital Age. And you heard Jim talk a little bit about the newspaper industry and what has happened to that. And what we want to do is bring some folks in, possibly even from the Washington Post, to talk about the digitization of the newspaper industry. For those of you who are parents of middle schoolers or high schoolers, we will also have a session on social media and youth culture, which there's a new book by a scholar. It's gotten very, very good reviews. And in the spring quarter, we are looking at a very general topic, technology and modern life, present shock when everything happens right now. So this is quite a different topic from what we've done this year in terms of it being broad, not looking at one sector of the economy. But there are certainly overlaps with what we've discussed during this past year. Again, thank you. We really do mean this, that this is a program that is built for the community that surrounds the University of Denver. We take our mission extraordinarily seriously, and thank you for joining us this evening.